The next thing we need to look at is how organisms are classified or how they're named. And to do that, we need to go over a couple of key terms here. And the first one is taxonomy. Taxonomy is the science of trying to classify organisms, trying to figure out how they may be related and organizing them into groups so that we can compare and look at family or biological relationships between them. The first guy to come up with this, and the system we actually still use today, is a system called binomial nomenclature. This was developed by a guy named Carl Linnaeus in the 1700s, and we still use it today, although when he came up with the system, he based it almost exclusively on how organisms looked. So if you had two organisms that looked very similar, he assumed that those two organisms must be more closely related than two organisms that looked quite different. And using that, he came up with the binomial nomenclature system that we still use today. And the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species was a big part, or at least parts of that originally were parts of how he organized those organisms. So the binomial means everything gets two names. And those two names are the genus and the species. So for example, humans are Homo sapiens. Our genus is Homo, and our species name is Sapiens. And every organism on the planet has a binomial nomenclature name. And let's go through a couple of examples, and maybe that'll kind of help that make sense to you a little bit. So you should remember these, hopefully, from earlier science courses, whether it's Science 9, Science 10. You need to make sure you know these if you don't already, that hierarchy of kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And that's going from very, very broad, like kingdom, to much, much smaller as we get down to, and this, eventually species, of a single individual species is what we're talking about. So kingdom would be like Animalia. It's very, very large, it's very broad, all of the animals are included. And then you go down from there. The phylum would be much smaller, and then the class, and then the order, until eventually you were talking about a single species. So let's go through a couple of examples here. You can fill these in your notes if you'd like. They're not anything you need to memorize, so if you don't want to, don't stress about it. I just want to show you some examples. So the three I picked are all from the kingdom Animalia. There are other kingdoms though. We'll talk about those in a second, and this whole system would work whether you're talking about animals or something else. Phylum, these are all phylum Chordata, and in this case that means they all have a spinal cord. You don't necessarily need to know that, but each of these has a specific meaning to them. Now we start to split. This first animal is from class Aves. That may kind of sound familiar to you, like avian, or talking about birds basically. The first one is in the class with the birds, while the other two are mammals, class Mammalia. Now order, sometimes these can get very big. A lot of these are based on Latin names, so they can get quite strange. The first one is Accipitriformes. I'm probably butchering that. It's okay. The second one is Cetartiodactyla. Sure. And the last one, a little bit easier to say, is Carnivora. So you can see now that we've basically distinguished, at least between these three animals, they're all separate now. The first one separated in class. These two here separated when we got to order. And the more related they are, the farther you'd get down this column before they started to split. So now we have family Accipitridae, Cervidae, and Canidae. Genus Buteo, Cervus, and let me get me out of the way here, Vulpes. And then species Gemalcensis, Canadensis, and Vulpes. So if you were to look at the actual names of these, the first one is actually a red-tailed hawk. Its binomial nomenclature name, remember, is genus and species, would be Buteo Gemalcensis. Probably butchering that pronunciation, but that would be its name. You'll notice too in the names, and this isn't in your notes, the genus is always capitalized, but the species is not. So Buteo is capitalized, Gemalcensis is lowercase. Okay, the second one is an elk, and the third one is a red fox. So every organism out there, plant, bacteria, it really doesn't matter. If we've identified it and classified it, it will have a binomial nomenclature name. And that's usually what scientists would use, because if you just say a fox, that's actually, there's probably many, many different species of hawks. And in many animals, there are subspecies of hawks or fox, or of any animals, where there may be parts of a species where they're slightly different, but if you remember back to our definition of a species, they haven't become so different that they can't interbreed. So we consider them subspecies. They're different kind of appearance or behavior or where they live or other characteristics, but they haven't become so different that they can't interbreed yet. So those would be subspecies. And there are subfamilies and suborders in some of these. You don't necessarily need to know about those. Again, don't memorize this. That's not the point of it. It's just to show you how this kind of a classification system works. Now, I mentioned the 6 kingdoms, and these are the 6 kingdoms. You need to make sure that you're aware of these, that you know the 6 kingdoms and how they work, or at least kind of generally what they're like. Now, these bottom ones are probably the ones that we're most familiar with. So Kingdom Animalia, Kingdom Plantae, Kingdom Fungi. The top 3 are probably the ones you're least familiar with. They're the microscopic organisms that we don't tend to think about or deal with too much, at least not by name. So the protists are kind of a weird group. The Archaebacteria and the Eubacteria are even weirder. Don't stress too much about knowing all the differences between them. You should know these 3 fairly well, right? Animalia are definitely heterotrophs, multicellular. Plantae is multicellular but autotrophic. Fungi are heterotrophs as well, but they do have a cell wall, kind of like a plant would, but they're heterotrophs, not autotrophs. And then when you get into the Eubacteria, Archaebacteria, and protists, they just get strange. We think, based on our current understanding and evidence, we think the Archaebacteria is the oldest, that they were some of the earliest forms of life on the planet. And you can see they live in some really extreme places, like those deep sea vents that we talked about. Really chemically hazardous environments. They tend to thrive in those kind of places, which is what the planet was like early on in its development. So it's probably a good bet that they were here first. And then the Eubacteria are also still bacteria, but they're a little bit more developed, a little bit more evolved, we think. Then the protists are things like you would find in a pond around here, even single-celled organisms like the amoebas and diatoms and things like that. So that's the 6 kingdom system. At the very least, I would say make sure you know all 6 kingdoms and know a general idea of, if I were to give you an example of something, which of these it might fit into, you'd probably be okay. Now, part of identifying things once they've been classified is you need to be able to go out and see something and find out what it's which of these groups or taxonomy groups we would put it into. And to do that, quite often what we use is called a dichotomous key. If you ever read a Choose Your Own Adventure book in school, it's very similar to that. We're going to follow the steps, and based on what our answers are, we're going to go to different steps until we get an answer. So for example, in this case, let's say you saw a squirrel. So you would go to number 1. The first question says, is hair present? You would say yes. And so that they would tell you right there, okay, that's class Mammalia, and you're done. If you were looking at a trout, for example, you'd say hair is absent. So I would go to step 2. Step 2 says, are feathers present or absent? I would say they're absent. So I would go to 3. Jaws present or jaws absent? Here you would say, yeah, it's whatever. And you get the idea. You're following through these steps till you end up in one of these groups. So it's kind of like a branching. Every branch only ever has has one question, and that one question has to have two answers. It's a yes or a no. And then you branch and you branch and you branch and you branch until eventually, in this case, they just took us to which class we were talking about. In some books, like a guidebook to insects or something like that. Actually, let me grab one. Just 1 second. Okay, so here's one, for example, a field guide to insects. I don't know if you, there you go. You can kind of see that, although it's backwards because I have my camera flipped. But this kind of a book would be something you could take out, let's say, on a walk down to the creek bed, and you could open it up, and it would have inside of it a dichotomous key, for in this case would be crickets, and you could follow the steps to go down and figure out exactly what cricket you were looking at. So scientists use dichotomous keys quite a bit in field guides and things like that to determine what kind of what organism exactly they're looking at or studying or just being around. Now, another term you need to be aware of is phylogeny. And phylogeny is taking all that classification that we've done, that naming and grouping, and kind of building it into what I would consider like a biological family tree, showing how related certain things we think they are, and then fitting that all together. So it might look something like this, where we have some of these organisms like the Neurospora and the Saccharomyces that are like the yeast, like little tiny things, that those are very distantly related. But if you look up at the top, you would see that, let's say, a chicken and a penguin are much closer related on those branches. Now, another term you may run into is, remember that Carl Linnaeus, if he was to build a tree like this, it would have been based entirely on appearance. The term we use now is quite often a phylogenetic tree, because we're not just using how organisms look or how they're built, but also their genetics. We can look at their genes, we can look at their protein sequences, we can look at all sorts of things to get a little bit more data to try to make this fit even tighter together. So in the end, though, we end up with this biological family tree that says, well, a horse and a donkey are really closely related, but they're not as closely related as the horse and the pig, or the horse and the rabbit, etc., like that. So that's a phylogeny. Hopefully that makes sense. If there's anything in here that doesn't make sense, let me know. We'll get into more of this as we get into the next section a little bit deeper after the test. But this gives you a good place to start for now. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you on the next one.